We got another day of NBA action. And with FanDuel, every night is a watch party. So it's time for your FanDuel crew to make their bets. So, what's the move tonight, gang? You know the new customers who bet $5 get $150 back in bonus bets? Woo-hoo, we're heating up, fam. Bet all the stars with all your friends and make every moment more. Only on FanDuel. New customers bet $5, get $150 back in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook.
It goes down in the DM. It go down in the DM.
21 plus and present in Virginia. First online real money wager only. $10 first deposit required. Bonus issued as non-withdrawable bonus bets that expire 7 days after receipt. See full terms at FanDuel.com/sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
Wars That Shaped the World uses dynamic, immersive audio to depict scenes of warfare. Listener discretion is advised. Mount Tumbledown is not much of a mountain. In fact, by most standards, it's not a mountain at all. Like the hills that surround it on East Falkland, Mount Kent, Mount Longdon, Two Sisters, Mount Harriet. It's the name that stands out. Names that have gone down in modern British history. Names that, for the men who fought on their slopes, will never be forgotten.
The battle was a terrifying experience. It's beyond words how frightening it was. On the second day, June 13th, at dusk, myself and one other were hit by a shell. I knew immediately I'd lost one of my legs. But they think the extreme cold helped stop the bleeding. When I got to a field hospital 30 minutes later, they had a heart attack because I'd lost so much blood. There was actually a time when I died, but they managed to resuscitate me.
We were told to move, which no one could quite understand because we could see all the rounds in front of us. We thought if we move forward, we're going to end up getting our heads cut off. I've always wondered about this, and I got the chance to ask my commanding officer about it later. What is it that makes people go forward when every instinct is to go back? His answer was training and honour. I think it's much more to do with the people you're with, not letting them down.
It was on these barren, rock-strewn hills that the final act of the Falklands War was fought out. A series of small unit actions containing extraordinary courage and leadership. This is Wars That Shaped the World.
I have myself full confidence that you all do their duty.
України, всіх друзів нашої країни. Слава Україні!
The contrast was acute. Paris in the springtime, the Palace of Versailles in all its gilded splendour, against a muddy foxhole in East Falkland with a South Atlantic winter looming. Ronald Reagan meeting Margaret Thatcher in the palace, Brigadier Julian Thompson under canvas, ordering his young men on an 87-kilometre yomp across freezing terrain. Thatcher saying no, Thompson getting the command to go. At Versailles, Reagan presented Thatcher with a 5-point United Nations plan, a last-gasp attempt to stop the conflict mid-flow. But it was too late. There was no agreement to be found. So from his tented HQ in San Carlos, a tiny settlement huddled on the west side of East Falkland, Brigadier Thompson dispatched his Marines and paratroopers on one of the most famous marches in British military history. Yomp is a word from the Royal Marine Dictionary. It means a long-distance march carrying full kit. The parachute regiment equivalent is tabbing, but it was Yomp that the accompanying war correspondents adopted and popularised. The terrain for this Yomp across the Falklands was tough, boggy, uneven, and conditions were dire, cold, wet, windy. Added to which the men were nearly weighed down with kit. Nearly everything had to be carried, so each was lumbered with around 50 kilos, double what the British soldier carried at Waterloo 150 years earlier. They marched in long columns, 10 yards behind the man in front, and they slept each night in the open. It took 3 draining days. Their final destination, Port Stanley, is shielded by a line of hills and ridges, control of which would be crucial for the final assault on the capital. Mount Kent, a stone-strewn hill of just over 1,000 feet, was the first in the way of the footsore British forces. The SAS had been sniffing around it for several weeks, occasionally engaging enemy patrols. On the 27th of May, they reported to Thompson there seemed to be only a handful of defenders on the summit. This was too good an opportunity to miss. Thompson scrambled together a force of Marines and squeezed them onto a couple of helicopters. There followed a daredevil flight across the island, barely 20 foot above the ground, to stay out of sight of any Argentine planes. The Marines tumbled from the choppers 2 miles short of the summit to the sounds of a nearby firefight. All went quiet, and an SAS man emerged from the gathering gloom and reported to Lieutenant Colonel Michael Rose, the SAS commander who'd flown in with the Marines.
No problem here, boss. There was an IG patrol up there, but we've malleted one lot and we'll sort the others out in the morning.
As darkness fell, a company of Marines hurried towards the summit. It was unoccupied, but not for long. It now belonged to the Marines. It was a freezing night. The men huddled down, shivering beneath flurries of snow. Not all had sleeping bags to see them through the night. But they had control of Mount Kent. Further along the ridgeline, the overworked helicopter pilots were ferrying more Marines from 42 Commando into position. They found neighbouring Mount Challenger free of the enemy too, dropping into abandoned Argentine trenches, kicking aside left-behind equipment. The Argentines who'd previously occupied these positions were the reinforcements flown over to Goose Green days earlier and never replaced. It was another terrible error by the Argentine commanders. .45 Commando completed the Yomp the hard way, every step on foot. When they arrived on the rear slopes of Mount Kent, the significant fighting force of 3 Commando Brigade was in position. Along the heights, the British dug in as the weather worsened. It wasn't long before dugouts filled with water, nor was it long before parallels were drawn with the trenches of Flanders. The most pressing battle was to keep warm and dry. Trenchfoot, that First World War curse, was back.
It was a grim ordeal. Living conditions were quite atrocious. Trenchfoot, exposure, significant problems.
It looked a bit like the Highlands, barren and bare. It was very cold and very wet.
Once more, it was a waiting game for the freezing and hungry commandos and paratroopers. This time, they were waiting for 5 Brigade.
The Queen Elizabeth II, just before she sailed on her maiden...
The 2nd British Brigade, ordered to the Falklands, sailed south in the QE2, off to war in a luxury liner. They sailed amid concerns over how battle-ready they were, and worries within the brigade over how adequately supplied they were. The issue was raised in the House of Lords by the father of one officer. They'd been given 2,000 winter jackets, but 1,000 pairs of trousers. Major General Jeremy Moore sailed with them. Moore, having directed operations from back home, was to take overall command from Julian Thompson when he arrived in San Carlos.
As she sliced through the sea, her massive turbines hummed sweetly.
5th Brigade was led by 47-year-old Tony Wilson, a dynamic commander who liked to wear a red beret and green Wellington boots in the field. He was to become a divisive figure in what happened next. Fingers of blame have been pointed his way. Others were directed at Moore's overall command. For Moore, the issue was what to do with 5 Brigade. There was a suggestion the Ministry of Defence meant them to serve as a garrison, to clear up once the Commando Brigade had kicked out the invaders. But Wilson was determined his men should be involved at the sharp end, and Moore agreed. Wilson had Welsh and Scottish Guards battalions, and a battalion of Gurkhas. 2 para, licking their wounds at Goose Green, were also transferred to Wilson's command. The initial problem facing Moore was a logistical one. He was desperately short of helicopters, and those he had were required to keep the commandos and paras on the heights west of Stanley supplied. Wilson tried to march his men to Goose Green, with the plan being the battalions would then leapfrog each other along the south stretch of East Falkland. This would bring them to the small settlements of Fitzroy and Bluff Cove. From there, they'd be in position to attack Stanley from the south. The plan fell at the first hurdle. After 12 hours plodding towards Goose Green, the Welsh Guards had to turn back. The men were laden down with equipment and exhausted by the conditions. The battalion had spent much of the previous year on ceremonial duties. No preparation for the demands of the Falkland Islands. The Marines and paras were not impressed. Wilson took a helicopter to Goose Green to 2 para. He wanted them to advance to Fitzroy and Bluff Cove, but how much opposition would they face? The question was answered when an advance party occupied a house en route and discovered the regular phone line to Fitzroy was still working.
Hello?
Hi, is your father there, please?
I'll go find him. Who shall I say is calling, please?
It's the British Army.
Hello? Ron Binney here.
Good afternoon, sir. Colonel Sergeant Morris speaking. Are you all right to speak to us?
Yes, Sergeant.
No, RG's near you.
They've gone. All of them. Just this morning. Blew the bridge to Bluff Cove and marched away. Not a sign of them since.
Thank you, sir. That's most helpful. We'll be along shortly.
Wilson ordered the paras to seize the moment. One company squeezed into a Chinook and was flown to the heights above Bluff Cove. Later that evening, a second company joined them. 5th Brigade, to Wilson's relief, and it should be noted the surprise of Moore's HQ, had made its first leap forward. But how to get the rest of the brigade round to Bluff Cove? The only feasible option was by sea, but it was no straightforward ferrying job. It was dangerous to make the journey by daylight. The threat of Argentine air attack may have receded, but it remained a live one. First, the Scots Guards were shipped round overnight by HMS Intrepid, before being transferred to 4 landing craft to make the final approach to Bluff Cove. It proved an ordeal. The weather worsened, the wind gusting at 70 knots. Ewan South Betalia, the Marines' Falklands expert, struggled to guide the craft towards their destination. It took 7 hours. 4 of the guardsmen stumbled ashore the following morning with exposure, and the situation didn't get any better. They arrived with no orders and joined the men of 2 para, themselves cold and wet, and hungry as they'd been given only 2 days' worth of rations in 5 days. Back in London, via Downing Street and the Northwood HQ, impatience continued to grow.
Mrs. Thatcher is under pressure to get Stanley. Every day it's not taken is another country lost to world opinion. We can't risk losing another ship, or the cabinet may be unable to resist pressure for a ceasefire.
There was equal impatience in the Falklands with London. Complaints London failed to grasp the challenges facing Moore and his men. On the 6th of June, the Welsh Guards were loaded onto HMS Fearless. They sailed through the dark to a proposed rendezvous point with South Betalia and his landing craft. But the weather was even more atrocious, and the landing craft could not leave Fitzroy, and HMS Fearless had no means of communicating with Fitzroy. As daylight approached, 2 companies of the Guards boarded Fearless's 2 landing craft, and while they made for Fitzroy, Fearless headed back to the relative safety of San Carlos, with the rest of the battalion still on board. That was the end of the road for the Navy. They would not expose Fearless on another such run. She was too important. Instead, Royal Fleet auxiliary ships would be used. These were crewed by civilians and had only elderly Bofors guns as air defence. Each part of the operation, land, sea and air, was creaking under the pressure. Too much expected of too few. The Navy were juggling 2 supply points, sending ships into Teal Inlet in the north to supply the commandos and paras, as well as having to deal with 5 brigades' unexpected demand. As the first half of the Welsh Guards arrived at Fitzroy in the landing craft, another ship, the auxiliary St. Tristram, dropped anchor with a supply of ammunition, to the surprise of the Marines running the beach. They'd no idea the St. Tristram was coming. Poor communication continued to hamper operations. That night, South Betalia was ordered to send a landing craft down to Goose Bay to collect 5 brigades signals equipment. Once that was in place, events should run more smoothly. Colour Sergeant Johnson was dispatched with orders to return the following night. It left only 1 landing craft in Fitzroy. At 7 a.m. the next morning, their crew were stunned to see the Galahad, another auxiliary vessel, steam into the cove. The previous evening in San Carlos, it had taken so long to load the Galahad, her captain expected departure to be postponed until the following night. But the Navy ordered him to sail. They left San Carlos 4 hours late and arrived with daylight in Fitzroy. Nobody was expecting them. It was the beginning of a disastrous day. The officers in charge of the Welsh Guards on Galahad had been ordered to join up with the rest of the battalion at Bluff Cove. Disembarking at Fitzroy would have meant a long march round the bay, although how long remains debated. A bridge across the cove halved the journey to around 7 miles. It had been destroyed by the retreating Argentines, but repaired, according to the Marines. It is unclear whether the Welsh Guards knew this. Having been marched halfway to Goose Green and back, the Guards officers were adamant they would not be messed around with again.
We're staying on the ship until Bluff Cove,
they insisted. To Ewan South Betalia, this was madness. The Marine Major commandeered the 1 remaining landing craft, half full of ammunition, and hurried over to the Galahad.
There was no doubt that these ships were in grave danger. There was no anti-aircraft defence at all.
He suggested, ordered, pleaded with the 2 Welsh Guard majors to get the men off. They refused. South Beatalia returned ashore, found a 5 Brigade staff officer, and repeated his plea. Meanwhile, on Galahad, a medical unit was being unloaded, its kit ferried ashore. Then another hiccup. The ramp jammed. Any men who came off would have to scramble down the side of the ship. South Beatalia, having tried everything he could, retreated to a house overlooking the bay. The owners, old friends, offered him a can of beer. He took a long swig, stared out over the bay, and saw exactly what happened next.
Oh, it was a terrible, terrible sight. The smell, the sights, the things in there, it was inhuman what you were looking at. It was a scene from hell. There were bodies, body parts everywhere. The ship was burning. Awful, absolutely awful.
At 1:10, 2 Mirages and 2 Skyhawks flashed into view. Andy Jones, a Welsh guardsman, was climbing a stairway on board the Galahad when the planes appeared.
We knew automatically that anything flying low was Argentinian and not British. As one, everybody turned and started to go back to the tank deck. And in a matter of seconds, honestly, the world turned orange. I was immediately picked up and thrown back the way I came. There was an instant fireball that came down through the ship.
As well as significant amounts of ammunition, Galahad was carrying petrol. Flesh melted from men's hands before their eyes. Survivors describe it all seeming to happen in slow motion. Andy Jones found himself with around 20 others in a corridor. At one end were explosions, at the other, rising water.
The thought was, which way do you want to die? That seriously was your decision. Were you going to shoot yourself? Because of the water on the floor? I'm not a Navy person, I don't know. Was the ship going down? Are you going to get blown up? Are you going to drown? And then you were thinking, how will my parents know how I died? That seriously was in my mind. My parents won't even know the manner of my death.
South Beatalia had made the beach.
I felt helpless and carried stretchers for a couple of hours from beach to helicopters.
Other helicopters used the draft of their rotors to prevent lifeboats being sucked towards the burning ship. 51 men were killed. 33 Welsh Guardsmen, 7 Royal Navy, and 11 other civilian seamen and soldiers. 46 were wounded, many with life-changing injuries. The survivors' faces were blackened as they were pulled from the water or lifeboat. But Britain's darkest day of the war was not over. At almost the same time as the attack on the Galahad, HMS Plymouth, a frigate, was hit by 4 1,000-pound bombs in Falkland Sound. And there was one more tragedy to come. Another Argentine attack on Fitzroy was beaten off, and as they turned for home, the aircraft spotted Colour Sergeant Johnson's landing craft heading back from Goose Green. Johnson had disregarded South Beatalia's suggestion he delay his return until after dark. Johnson had been fired on by the Navy on a previous night, so preferred to return in daylight. It was a fatal decision. The landing craft stood no chance. Johnson and 5 of his crew were killed in the first attack. Only one body was ever recovered. It was a loss that hit Johnson's colleagues hard.
When something like that happens, it doesn't make sense. People you've known for years, known their families, their children. It's unbelievable. Devastating.
It had been a devastating day. At last, all eyes turned to Port Stanley. The British, from their mountaintop outposts, looked down on their final objective: take Stanley, and the war was done. But taking Stanley appeared anything but simple. Against the 2 British brigades were 8,400 Argentinian troops, well entrenched, armed with heavy weapons and ample ammunition. Their positions were strong, dug into the hills that immediately covered Stanley, hills such as Tumbledown, screened by minefields and supported by significant artillery firepower. The Argentinians were confident, at least in their HQ and in the Casa Rosada, the presidential palace back in Buenos Aires. The Argentine ambassador in Washington told an American contact Stanley could hold out for at least 2 months. And while they did, Argentina's Navy and Air Force would chip away at British supply lines. It meant plenty of time to cook up a face-saving diplomatic solution. The defence of Goose Green gave the British pause for thought. A well-dug-in and supplied force of men, determined to fight, could cause significant casualties. Argentina's soldiers may have been in strong positions, but all was not well. Far from it. Their largely conscript force was not equal to the sum of its parts. Many of those parts simply wanted to go home.
No one had really believed we were going to fight. But when the English started attacking, everyone started to get worried.
One conscript soldier said some of his comrades didn't even know where the Malvinas were, let alone why they were there. Their morale suffered under appalling treatment by their own officers. Men were beaten or made to strip off their boots and sit with bare feet in freezing water for hours.
The life of a ship was worth more than a soldier. There were soldiers that died of hunger, and there was worse, much worse. I was witness to the death of a soldier who was punished by sleeping outside of his position. And one morning we found him between the rocks, covered by a poncho, almost frozen with convulsions. He did not survive the cold.
The frontline soldiers were poorly supplied. Some took to walking the 3 miles back to Stanley after dark and looting supply depots. The British were better supplied, but their conditions were as grim, especially in the exposed mountaintop conditions. The freezing wind, the freezing cold, the freezing mud. They shivered in their foxholes and tents, added boiling water to their beef and mashed potato powder rations, and wrote eve of battle letters home.
It shouldn't be too long, and I promise you, I won't take needless risks. I think of you all so much and love you all so dearly. I so long to be back with you, and I shall value our life together as never before after this. One takes so much for granted.
To everyone's relief, it was time for the final act.
This is the decisive battle of the war. Surprise and absolute silence are vital. If necessary, make every man jump up and down before he starts to make sure nothing rattles. Persistent coffers must be left behind. If you find yourself in a minefield, remember you must go on. They must go through and finish the attack, or it will cost more lives in the end. The enemy are well dug in very strong positions, but I believe once we get in among them, they will crack pretty quickly. We want to end up with Argies running all the way back to Stanley to show the others what's coming for them.
The British plan was to attack at night. They believed Goose Green had shown the advantages of attacking under cover of darkness. When night fell on the 11th of June, columns of men began to snake forward. Whispered commands directing them passed back along the columns. As the men advanced, the British guns began their barrage, supported by the Navy out at sea. 42 Commando yomped round the Argentine line, somehow unnoticed, and attacked up the rear of their objective, Mount Harriet. They were barely 100 metres from the top when the Argentinians opened fire. The commandos stormed forward, clearing dugouts and gun positions yelling warnings and instructions when and where to fire their 66mm rockets. There were acts of individual courage. Larry Watts, a corporal, cleared one position on his own with grenades and then came face to face with a rifle. As he grabbed it, the Argentine fired, and as they grappled for control of the rifle, a second bullet hit Watts. It was the fatal shot. The summit was soon taken. One of the most demanding tasks of the night, achieved for the loss of one brave man.
Zulu, Zulu. Zulu, Zulu.
45 Commando found the going tougher, but worked their way towards their objectives, bringing all the firepower they could muster onto the enemy position. They took their summit, Two Sisters, with yells of their war cry, Zulu, Zulu, ringing through the night. They'd been fighting for 2.25 hours.
It wasn't anything like the movies. I'd expected big balls of flame, yet they were just big bangs. I saw shrapnel bouncing off the rocks, and it seemed like some sort of natural phenomenon.
I felt neither hatred nor friendliness towards the Argentinians. I simply thought about the job in hand, and they happened to be in the way of getting that job done.
HMS Glamorgan provided fire support. At 2:35 a.m. she was returning to the task force when an Exocet struck her upper deck. The explosion was visible by the men fighting on the hills above Stanley. It killed 13 men, but the ship survived. The toughest fight of the night came on the windswept slopes of Mount Longdon. 3 para were tasked with the assault and found themselves facing formidable opposition. An entire battalion, as well as snipers with night vision sights, rather than the expected solitary company. They were joined by Terry Peck, a Falkland Islander and an extraordinary figure. A former chief of police on the islands, he'd spent the previous few weeks evading the invaders on a motorbike and living wild. Peck had taken photographs of Argentine positions using a camera hidden in a drainpipe and stuffed down his trousers. Somehow he evaded capture and escaped to the British lines with the help of a 14-year-old boy, Saul Pitaluga. Peck armed himself with a shotgun and joined the Paras as a guide. The struggle for Mount Longdon turned into the sort of engagement the British Army has fought for generations, in war after war. Small groups of men attacking and taking the hill, dugout by dugout. It was hard, costly, tough fighting. Small unit actions executed by well-trained and committed men. There were acts of extraordinary individual bravery. Sergeant Ian Mackay took over command of his platoon when his officer was wounded. He led an attack on a bunker and managed to destroy it with 2 grenades before being shot and killed. Mackay followed his fellow paratrooper H. Jones in being awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross. The fighting lasted all night, the final Argentine positions taken as dawn began to break.
I shall never forget the sight that morning. Of A Company advancing through a thick mist, with bayonets fixed.
They took the final positions the old-fashioned way. But the Paras' victory came at a price. 23 dead and 47 wounded.
I suppose it was as fine a feat of arms as 3 para had ever undertaken. But what a cost. And such good people lost. So terribly young, mostly.
While the Paras and the Marines had taken their primary objectives, it was too late to press on towards Mount Tumbledown and its network of trenches and bunkers. An attack in daylight would have been too costly. Instead, it fell to 5 Brigade to mount the assault on Tumbledown. Helicopter problems meant the attack was delayed until the following night. At 9 p.m, the Scots Guards crossed the start line amid flurries of snow. Their first objective taken, they began to advance up Tumbledown itself, straight into Argentina's best force on the islands, 92 men and machine guns of the 5th Marines. First, snipers with night sights began to pick off the guardsmen, and then the machine guns opened up.
It was just hugely confusing. Lots of bangs and flashes and very loud noises. We were pretty much pinned down. It was terrifying, to be honest. It was terrifying.
The Argentine positions were covered by large rocks that littered the hillside, and the Scots Guards could make little headway. They could hear the enemy singing and chanting in their bunkers. Finally, at 2:30, 5.5 hours after crossing the start line, Major John Kisley leapt to his feet and charged towards the enemy, yelling,
"Are you with me, 13th Platoon?"
The platoon, followed by the rest of Left Flank Company, charged up the hill led by Kisley, who himself killed 3 Argentines, the last with his bayonet. He was lucky, very lucky. A bullet hit his bayonet scabbard and thudded into his compass. It was 15 Platoon who first made the summit. Just 7 of them, and 3 were machine-gunned within moments. The remaining 4 hung on until reinforcements arrived. Kisley lost 7 men, with a further 21 wounded to take his objective, and handed over to Right Flank Company at 6 a.m. It took another 6 hours for the Scots Guards to secure Tumbledown. In all, they lost 9 men to claim victory over one of Argentina's elite units. The guardsmen handed out barley sugars to their starving prisoners, then took over their trenches. The action switched at once to the north of Tumbledown, where 2 para were tasked with taking Wireless Ridge. They were determined to put the lessons learnt from Goose Green into effect. They would advance with overwhelming firepower. Conscripts, so the theory went, would not cope with it. And when theory was put into practice, it worked to a T. Backed by naval guns, Blues and Royal Scorpions and scimitars, artillery and machine guns, 2 para swept upwards and swept all before them. It did not take long for them to secure the ridge and start brewing up. And then, it was over. The radio crackled into life.
"The Argies are legging it. They're running everywhere."
The soldiers rose from their foxholes and peered down. It was a sight for sore eyes. Argentinian forces in full flight, simply legging it back to Stanley. The conscript army had had enough.
Everything was in terrible disorder. Nobody really knew what the orders were, whether we should go on fighting or not. We were all very nervous after what we had lived through.
As they rushed into Port Stanley, some of the bedraggled, hungry Argentines saw plentiful supplies of food and clothing. Yet they'd been left with next to nothing. They couldn't believe their eyes. Some burst into tears. The British couldn't quite believe it either. Julian Thompson arrived on Wireless Ridge to see David Chandler, H. Jones's successor in charge of 2 para, standing in the open. Thompson tried to pull him into cover.
God's sake, David, get down!
It's okay, Julian. It's over. Look.
2 para advanced down the hill and headed for the capital. The end was in sight. Across the Argentine front line, resistance melted away. Outside Port Stanley, the paratroopers took off their helmets and replaced them with red berets. They'd reached the racecourse when the order came to halt. They were to wait for surrender negotiations to be completed before advancing any further. The exhausted men collapsed into the grandstand. It left Max Hastings, the war correspondent who was to write the definitive history of the conflict, to wander down the road into Stanley on his own. He ended up in the pub, the Upland Goose, where he was welcomed by the landlord, Desmond King.
We never doubted for a moment the British would come. We've just been waiting for the moment. Cheers.
The official moment arrived some hours later. Michael Rose, the SAS commander, and Rod Bell, a Spanish-speaking Marine, the only one in the entire task force, spent the afternoon negotiating with General Menendez, the Argentine commander. There were tears in Menendez's eyes when he agreed to surrender all Argentine forces on the Falkland Islands. At 9 p.m, Monday the 14th of June, General Moore arrived in Stanley by helicopter, and the two generals signed the agreement. The war was over. Back in London, the government imposed a blackout over news from the Falklands. They knew the British attacks had been successful and knew the Argentine defences had collapsed. But Margaret Thatcher wanted to announce the final outcome on her terms in the House of Commons. At 10:15 p.m, she stood at the dispatch box.
Our forces reached the outskirts of Port Stanley. Large numbers of Argentine soldiers threw down their weapons. They are reported to be flying white flags over Port Stanley. Our troops have been ordered not to fire except in self-defense.
Labour leader Michael Foot's response was to the point.
But at this moment, those pressures and anxieties may be relieved, and I congratulate her upon that.
When Thatcher returned to Downing Street, a crowd gathered outside and sang Rule Britannia.
Maybe some of the things we were taught about the Malvinas were not right. When we heard that you were on Mount Kent, we knew we could not win. It was just that in the beginning, nobody in Argentina believed you would really send such a force to capture the Malvinas.
The Falklands War left 255 British dead, 777 wounded. It was 1/3 of the British casualties in the Korean War, and fewer than were killed in Northern Ireland. Argentina put their losses at 652 dead. It was a dramatic and overwhelming triumph for Britain's military, for the men on the ground, the soldiers, sailors, and airmen. Back home, Britain, to Thatcher's urging, celebrated long and loud. There was a victory parade through London, huge gatherings when each chunk of the task force returned. This small colonial war,
a freak of history,
Max Hastings called it, took its place in British history, and it helped shape British history for decades to come. It directed Argentine history too. Within months, the junta had collapsed. Its demise was inevitable. Its decision to try and buy more time by invading the Falklands only served to bring forward its end. Thatcher's premiership changed with the Falklands. The Iron Lady emerged. The struggles and unpopularity of her early years swept away by victory. She was to remain in power for a further 8 years, before falling, coincidentally, during Britain's next war, the first in the Gulf.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11.5 wonderful years.
That it had come to war in the Falklands was, from the British perspective, a painful political failure and a startling failure of intelligence. Successive governments, including Thatcher's, were at fault. John Nott, Britain's Defence Secretary, wrote of having to use the globe in his office to remind himself where the Falkland Islands were when the scrap metal merchants began causing trouble in South Georgia.
It was the sort of problem,
said Javier Perez de Cuellar, Secretary General of the United Nations.
Which would take 10 minutes to solve if both sides were willing.
But they weren't.
The Falklands thing,
wrote the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges,
was a fight between two bold men over a comb.
On the evening of the 14th of June, 1982, amid the wreckage of war on Mount Tumbledown, James Riddell, pipe major of the Scots Guards, tore a scrap of paper from his ration pack and began to sketch out a tune, as pipers had done on battlefields far from home for hundreds of years. His tune was The Crags of Tumbledown Mountain, written in memory of his comrades who died on its slopes and all those who'd fallen across the Falklands and the seas that surround it. This is the end of the first season of Wars That Shaped the World. This series featured Alejandro Teran, Thomas Mitchells, Tim Skinner, George Still, Marta da Silva, Gerardo Cabal, Nazan Fernandez, and Darcy Ferguson. Wars That Shaped the World was a Goalhanger Podcasts production. It was produced by Holy Smokes. This series was written by Robin Scott Elliot. It was narrated by Paul Waggott. The producer was Neil Fearn. The executive producer was Tony Pastor.
Holy Smokes.